Thank you. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me to talk on economic impact. Now, I am not a health economist, and I was a bit scared of this talk, actually. But it led me to to have a real think and read about economic value of vaccines, in fact, and I've learned a lot. So I'm hoping to educate you a little bit about how economic evaluations are done. So I am a member of ATAGI. These are my views, not those of ATAGI necessarily. Look, we've had a really fantastic introduction here from Tony. So some of my slides perhaps are a little redundant. We talked about what zoster is, and we've also talked about the fact that people can get and experience post-herpetic neuralgia. So the rash, the pain that can persist over 90 days after having experienced shingles. But you can see from the presentation we've just had that the economic and clinical burden of zoster is really quite substantial. And a lot of people think that older people are more of a burden on the health system. And I think people often forget that they actually make a huge contribution to the economy when they're well. They look after grandchildren, they do voluntary work, they spend their money and their pensions. And so all of that is very beneficial to society. And we know that the number of the world's aging population is going to increase very considerably in the coming years. But when they get ill, they're more prone to severe outcomes from infections. And they also, when they're older, are a great drain on health resources. And therefore, healthy aging is becoming more and more of a public health priority. And there's really an increasing interest in vaccination programs for aging people and those that are more vulnerable. We've already heard about the aging immune system. So essentially the innate and the adaptive arms of the immune system decline, and you can see on the slide some of the ways in which that decline occurs, but it's across all arms of the immune system that there are changes. And that leads to suboptimal responses to infections, but also suboptimal responses to vaccination. The other thing that happens is a process called inflammaging, that's inflammation aging. And this is a characteristic thing that happens as you get older and leads to enhanced immune activation, which we know is bad for you. It leads to cellular senescence, to DNA degradation, to the microbiome being altered and dysregulated. And all of this can predict frailty, it can predict cognitive impairment, and is also known to be an early predictor of death if you have quite a high inflammaging response. Shingles incidence obviously increases with age, as we've heard, and the severity of the disease, and therefore the public health burden. So we've heard about the recombinant vaccine, and that has been described to you, the adjuvanted recombinant vaccine based on glycoprotein E with the AS01B adjuvant. And that compares to the Zostavax vaccine, which is a live attenuated ochre strain vaccine, which doesn't obviously have an adjuvant, being a live vaccine, and is needed to be given as a single dose. The problem with that, of course, is contraindicated in immunocompromise and pregnancy, and we'll talk about how effective it is in a moment as well. Whereas the new recombinant vaccine is, of course, safe in immunocompromise and pregnancy. So just going back to the registration, the Zostavax was registered in 2007 for people of 50 years and over, and was added to the National Immunisation Programme in November 2016 for immunocompetent people aged 70, with a catch-up programme 71 to 79, and I'm sure most of you are across that. The Shingrix vaccine was registered in Australia in 2018, and as we all know, became available on the market in 2021, but then was added to the NIP November last year, hence the fact that we're talking about it. And there is a bit of a price differential. Now, what the government actually paid and negotiated for their Shingrix, I don't know, but we know that this is a very expensive vaccine and obviously requires 2 doses for optimal protection. So how does Zostavax play in terms of efficacy? So there's been several trials looking at efficacy in those over the age of 60. That was published in the New England Journal back in 2005. And then another trial, the ZEST trial, in the 50 to 59-year-olds, which was published in CID in 2012. And the efficacy compared to the vaccine that we've just been hearing about was around 50%, and against post-herpetic neuralgia, 66.5% in that study. But what was very concerning was the efficacy decreased with age. So you can see here that in the 50 to 59-year-olds, it was almost 70%, but dropping to under 40% in those over the age of 70. And more concerningly, there was no significant efficacy in those over 80 in these trials. And the waning also was quite significant. In one of the trials, by 8 years, it's down to 16.5% efficacy. So clearly this vaccine is not an optimal vaccine from these points of view. So in terms of trying to do analyses of cost effectiveness, of course, it's quite difficult to challenge the number of understand the number of cases in Australia. And there isn't a systematic evaluation plan for zoster incidence and post-herpetic neuralgia. And therefore, we were talking about earlier, case ascertainment is key if you're going to actually be looking at the burden and understanding the economic impact of a vaccine. But there have been analyses of what the introduction of the Zostavax vaccine into the NIP, the impact of it. And it's felt that there's been modest reductions only in the incidence of zoster and its complications. So not really a really profound impact. And there have been a number of challenges. And again, these have been discussed this morning. The initial year of introduction, only about 16% of the population age 70 took up the vaccine. That's doubled since then to around 32%. But that's still not a huge, only 1/3 of the population. And of course, there's also been the safety concerns of inadvertent administration to people with immunocompromise, and that has happened quite a bit and has led to 3 deaths in Australia since that vaccine was introduced. So we've heard about the trials from Shingrix. I'm going to give just a very brief points to this because Tony's beautifully described in a lot more detail. But this phase 3 trial published in 2015 was in over 15,000 people, 2 doses given 2 months apart, and they looked at 3 different age groups. And essentially, we've already heard very impressive efficacy, sort of 96, 97% across all age groups, including those older age groups. This is another trial published the following year in the New England Journal, and this was a second trial that was performed concurrently across all the same sites, 13,900 people, and again, impressive efficacy, and even in those over the age of 80, almost 90% efficacy. And overall, these studies would suggest that vaccination costs of this vaccine, although we know it's quite expensive, would be somewhat offset by the reduced healthcare visits and medication expenses that are required for treating the people and the cases that have been prevented. And that brings me to economic evaluation. So how do we do an economic evaluation of vaccine? Bearing in mind, I don't do this. But we had a discussion this morning about this, and different models are used. But for all the economic evaluations that I can see of zoster-related vaccines, they've used a Markov model on the whole, which is a stochastic random probability model where the state at each node is dependent on your state for your previous node. So what you can see in this, don't think the pointer's working, but what you can see is that you start out and you either get zoster or you don't. And if you do get zoster, then you can either recover, you can get post-herpetic neuralgia, you can die. So each way along, it depends on what state you're in from the previous part of the model. But economic evaluation is exceptionally complicated, and these are all the many factors that you have to take into account in any economic evaluation. So you obviously need to know the epidemiology. We've heard a lot about that, but often the precise data are not available, as I've said. Vaccine efficacy and duration of protection are key, as are adverse events in terms of uptake. The impact of aging on immunity, the impact of comorbidities, Then the health sector costs, with the major factor, of course, being the cost of the vaccine, but also the implementation of the program. What are the hospitalization costs for those that get the disease, which are higher in older people, the cost per bed per day, GP visits, medication, and then loss of productivity costs. So this can be time off work for people, carers, family, inability for older people to do voluntary work. So all of that should be factored into the model as best you can manage to do that. And QALYs, quality adjusted life years, are a classic measure that are used, and they can be either in terms of quantity around mortality or quality of life in terms of morbidity. And often this biases towards younger age groups because they live longer, but it is better if you can do a factor in for age as well when you're looking at your QALYs and actually put a social value judgment on that quality of life years over time, depending on your age group. So there's been a number of cost-effective and effectiveness analyses done. This study I'm going to talk about here was the Canadians doing a study for their population of the Shingrix recombinant vaccine compared to no vaccine, compared to Zostavax in those age over 60. They used a classic Markov model that I've described. It looks fairly simplistic. Did 5 different age groups, and they looked at health outcomes and cost with a 1% discount per year. And they estimated a coverage of 80% for the first vaccine and 75% uptake for the second vaccine in that population. And basically, they estimated it to be cost effective compared to no vaccination. And then compared to the live vaccine, there was a greater cost, but that cost worked out at an average incremental cost effectiveness ratio, that's an ISA, was $2,396 per QALY. Now, that is well below the Canadian willingness to pay threshold, and that's what they need to take into account. What's the willingness to pay? That's $50,000 per QALY, would be their standard cost and effectiveness threshold. And so essentially, they concluded that this was a vaccine that was cost effective to be introduced in that age group. In Germany, they did a study, published a study of Shingrix versus no vaccination, again used a Markov model. They looked in 4 different age groups, but they only put in a coverage of 40% and then 70% compliance with the next dose. And they decided also in their study that there was definitely a cost benefit, but they found, in fact, in their analyses that if you vaccinated the population over the age of 60 and above, that would be the best value from a public health and economic impact. And I won't go into all those figures in the interest of time, but the number needed to vaccinate in all age groups was between 7 and 9, which seems reasonable, but was higher for post-herpetic neuralgia. But they looked at different scenarios and looked at different ICEs and decided that actually that younger age group would be a better group to be aiming for. The Americans also, the CDC, did their cost-effective analyses, and that was to inform ACIP so they could make their deliberations and recommendations. And they modeled 100% compliance to second dose. So you're seeing that each of these analyses is actually using different inputs, which makes things complicated. But they came to then recommend recombinant zoster vaccine for people over the age of 50, and that it should be given to people who previously received the live vaccine and that they preferred recombinant over the live. And in fact, the live vaccine was discontinued in November 2020. So the initial PBAC application in 2018 was rejected here due to uncertainties around cost effectiveness. But as we all know, it was NIP listed in November last year and covers around 5 million of the population, and we've already heard about which groups are recommended for the vaccine. If you've had a previous free Zostavax shingles under the NIP, you're not eligible for a free Shingrix if you've had the zoster, but if you paid for it yourself, you can, but you should wait at least 12 months between receiving the 2. So in summary, the economic and public health burden of zoster and post-herpetic neuralgia and some of the other complications is considerable. The recombinant vaccine is highly effective and does produce long-lasting immunity. The cost-effectiveness analyses are very complex, but those that are published and those that have been done seem to suggest that it is actually there's a cost benefit in high socioeconomic countries, but the actual recommended ages vary from one country to another, and that space may change in Australia too in due course. So thank you.
So, a couple of questions online. I'll only just take one now, and then we'll go to the panel. But the one was, the Americans are very good at compliance, apparently 100%. Germans are only 70%. I would have thought maybe the other way. What do you reckon Australia is going to get, and what was the modelling in Australia, if you know?
So the Australian population, I think different people have looked at different values in terms of the uptake, but I think they've looked at flu vaccination and the uptake for that, and based some of the assumptions on flu vaccine uptake, which is nowhere near 100% and sort of more like 60%, I would say. But I can't recall the exact figures done in the Australian modelling. And I also didn't want to talk about the specific Australian economic analyses because it's a bit of an ongoing topic at the moment. Yeah.